this is going to be maybe policy-oriented one and less on academic theories. So, I was looking at the data, and the Chinese investment coming to Malaysia really started to surge in the year 2013, when the Chinese President Xi Jinping launched his very ambitious Belt and Road project, and our government found it useful to receive that kind of funding, and it got me thinking: is there a theoretical foundation to explain FDI? Why would China be so interested in investing in Malaysia and also in different countries? And also, why would Malaysia be so keen to accepting its inflow? So it's still a very new topic for me, but I happen to be looking at the Dunning's paper on the role of eclectic paradigm as a way to understand FDIs. So the development of theoretical models for FDI really started in the 1960s, just when FDI flows started to arise. Before that, there wasn't a underlying theoretical model to explain FDI, but more on trade. The rise of FDI flows in the post-World War II period has prompted researchers to develop a theory, and I'll be using Dunning's eclectic paradigm to speak about FDI. And more importantly, as a student of economics, I was taught about Ricardian theory of comparative advantage to trade British butter with Portuguese wine. That was what I was taught in school. That if the British find it a lot more efficient in using these resources, then they should specialize in that production. But if you look at the world today, the production is so fragmented, and it got me wondering: does this model still hold? In traditional theory, the firm is treated as a black box, and some authors even mention that there's no possibility of FDI because all firms should have equal access to resources within their own country, and that resources are not movable. And some of the feeling that I get from reading these papers and the responses to this paper is that, first of all, it's quite static, as though there is an equilibrium, but not taking into consideration how things can change over time. The dynamism is quite industry neutral. Different industries have different endowments, and the mobility of resources can differ from one sector to another. And I have a feeling also that this theory seems to operate in vacuum, which doesn't take into account the government policy, technological advancement, labor, trade union, who gets to capture the value that's been created in a investment or trade. And of course, the biggest complaint that I may have is it doesn't take into account the fragmentation of global production. So this is a fun cartoon that I found. Comparative advantage: the tall guy should specialize in apple picking and strawberry picking. But this next figure is just to highlight the point that many things are being produced by many different countries along the value chain that goes into the final product of a plane. So again, it's no longer the case of British butter for Portuguese wine, but how can countries each specialize in the niches along the supply chain of a plane manufacturing that results in the final product. Dunning's eclectic paradigm has been very popular. I think it's been used for since the 80s, I think, because I think it's one of the few frameworks that you can operationalize to understand determinants of FDI. Multinational companies undertake FDI to augment comparative advantage. OLI is the three components within the paradigm: ownership. So an anchor firm, a leader firm, would engage in FDI if its competitive advantage is greater relative to firms in the host nation. Locational, if the host economy happens to possess resources which favor an anchor firm and may also help to expand its ownership advantage. And lastly is the question on how much should a foreign investor internalize its production. Does it make sense for a MNE to arrive at a host economy and internalize the production, or should they just offshore or get licensing and franchise it and not being involved in the production? This theory seems to suggest that anchor firm gets to decide what to do. That anchor firm has the power to dictate, coming to the country and exploit the advantage, and it may not explain questions on how some of these multinational firms are increasingly coming more from the developing world, and whether or not they have the same power to fully capture the advantage. But before we go there, this is the timeline of Dunning's 4 classic motives of FDI. The first one is market seeking. So immediately after the period of World War II, multinationals are conducting market seeking activities, establishing investments all over the world, seeking to expand its production and market. Then come the inflationary pressure in the 70s, where resource seeking becomes the main motive, and efficiency seeking is just to understand how to optimize the different resources that they have. The rise of having headquarters to coordinate global activities, and lastly, the strategic asset seeking. I think, to be honest, I feel like market seeking and resource seeking is a bit more distinguishable. The rest are just about augmenting the comparative advantage. I was trying to mention about this just now. When it comes to Dunning's understanding of FDI, he seems to suggest that the anchor firm, the lead firm, has all the power to decide how to capture the value coming from a host nation. But increasingly, we are seeing a lot of MNEs coming out from developing countries, especially from China, and whether or not they have the kind of power as well to get into a host economy and to manage and manipulate the supplier governance structure and the supply chain. And some of these Chinese companies, they could be at a very weak position when they try to get into a market where there is already well-established MNCs operating there. So the first perhaps the gap in Dunning's paper is that the fragmentation and integration of global production activities may suggest that you have to look at industry-specific point of view rather than macro, because each industry has different governance and structure in its value chain. And second, is to reiterate the point that the idea of a all-powerful global lead firm may not apply for companies, MNEs from a developing nation. This is an example of what I meant by governance of value chain or supply chain. So to simplify things, there are 5 different types of your relationship between an anchor firm and its suppliers in the host nation. So it depends on complexity of transactions, how easy is it possible to codify the transactions, and whether or not the existing capabilities in the supply base is strong. So if you're in a market where it's very easy to codify the transaction, you do not need that many informal transactions, perhaps a market structure would be able to solve the problem. This reminds me of the Starbucks market, where the anchor firm, let's say Starbucks, entering into a market and just getting the beans. There's very little need for transaction, and at the other extreme will be full in the vertical integration. Captive would be very interesting. Captive type reminds me of the automotive industry in this region, where the anchor firm could be some of these Japanese companies, and all the vendor companies will just grow with Japanese companies at its core. So then you allow for a lot of interaction, and perhaps this could lead to technology transfer and upgrading. So this is a very different world from Ricardo's idea of trade, and he may not have foreseen such a development in global production. Some policy implications. So this is an example of a value chain in automotive industry. For the Philippines, what they do is they are not interested in having a national brand for the country, but they would specialize in the electronics component of the car. And instead of asking themselves whether or not they have the competitive advantage in producing a car, they're saying, let's focus on bits and niches within the chain, and just to specialize in that component. Some policy implications is that there is a potential for industrial upgrading. If you think of production in a value chain point of view, for example, in the case of Philippines, because they specialize in fixing the electrical component within the car, they can then also learn to fix this in the airline, in the planes. And they're just like the region's best electrical component producers. And another thing for policy is to suggest that perhaps we should not think about being good at producing a final good or services, but to try to understand how a good and services is being produced at a global stage, and where can we fit within that niche along the chain. Okay, so that's my short sharing. Thank you. Okay. Yes, Renato.
So it's Sturgeon. He's a friend of mine.
Oh, okay.